Hello, beautiful soul. My name is Yulia, and I'm the voice of the podcast Love to Heal. This podcast outlines my journey from atheism to Judaism, exploring spirituality from diverse perspectives. It is my hope that my journey will inspire others to embark on their own adventure of self-discovery and spiritual growth. Hello. I am glad you could join me on this episode about being Jewish in the South. By the way, if you are enjoying this podcast and wish to show your support, the best way to do that is by leaving a comment, a rating, and of course, sharing it with others. Let's begin. For my kids' spring break this year, 2026, we decided to go to New Orleans. My husband was already there for work, so it made sense for us to join him there and explore a city that none of us were familiar with. The first step, as usual, to making the itinerary was to see if there was a Chabad in the area so that we could go to Shabbat services and also to see what else there was relating to Jewish history and culture. It turned out that there are quite a few synagogues in New Orleans. So I went to my rabbi for suggestions. His son-in-law and his daughter, they happen to know the person who runs the Orthodox synagogue, which is called Anshe Sfard, and it's in a historic building. So I heard it was supposed to be very beautiful and interesting, and it was walking distance from the famous French Quarter. They also suggested that we go there for Saturday morning services because there would likely be more kids there, and that way my kids would have some company too. Then I reached out to the rabbi of that synagogue, Rabbi Rifkin, and he quickly responded. We were welcome to attend any of the services, and also if we wished to have Shabbat dinner with the host family, he would arrange that for us. For whatever reason, though, my husband and I were somewhat shy about going to a stranger's house for Friday night, so we decided against that idea. But we did promise to show up for services in the morning. Then my husband and I did some more research on New Orleans and decided that we would take a tour of another historic synagogue called the Touro Synagogue. And besides that, we would plan to visit the Museum of Southern Jewish Experience. And we felt like that was a good amount of Jewish to do on spring break. And since we were there only arriving on Wednesday night and leaving Sunday morning. So pretty packed schedule and lots of Jewish activities. So we were happy with that part of the itinerary. Of course, we also made sure we had time to tour the French Quarter, the Garden District, take a ride on the steamboat, and all that good stuff. And all that jazz, I should say, because New Orleans is all about jazz. A few days prior to spring break, our oldest daughter, she's a senior in high school, she was to travel with her friends to the Dominican Republic. And she found out from her friends that they all had CLEAR, this identity verification. And so they told her if she didn't have it, they would likely get through the TSA security line much faster and she would be left behind. So to avoid this, we decided to look into CLEAR as well. There was a 3-month free trial for the whole family, so we figured why not? We went ahead and registered everyone for the service, and boy, were we glad we did. Because the week of spring break, there were so many problems at airports nationwide. This was because of the TSA staffing crisis, the ICE agents, the strikes. It was crazy. And you may not think that God had anything to do with this, but in my book, this was clear guidance, pun intended. My husband flew into New Orleans several days prior to my kids' departure. And this was going to be my very first time flying alone with my kids. Now, I had flown dozens of times by myself, but for some reason, taking the kids with me by myself seemed overwhelming and nerve-wracking. I don't know why. I kept telling myself, though, that I would not really be alone, that God would be there with me, and that definitely helped me stay calm. The day of our flight, I had lots of things to do and errands to run. I had to teach my 2 classes at the university, after which I would drive home, pick up my kids, take an Uber to the airport, and I had only 2 hours from the Uber ride to the flight. Only 2 hours to do all that. Well, and then of course you have to think there could be long lines at security, at TSA, etc. And also, I had never used Uber in my own city, so I didn't even know how reliable it was. So I left it all up to God. And let me tell you, the miracles that day were many. I got home right on time from my job. The Uber came a few minutes early. We got to the airport with no issues or traffic. And get this, we were the only ones in the security line. No joke. I had never seen anything like that. And then we made it to the gate with more than half an hour of time left, so we could relax, have a snack before the flight. It was great. The flight from Cleveland to our layover in Houston was also on time and wonderful in every aspect. Shout out to United for providing kosher snacks. Very nice. And then when we arrived there, I thought we would need to hurry and look for the gate for the next flight. We didn't have much time between flights. It was, I think, 40 minutes or so. But guess what? The next gate turned out to be literally 5 steps away. The next gate over. And then the flight to New Orleans was just as great and on time. My kids behaved. Everything was smoother than any travel experience I had ever had in my life. How great is Hashem? Yes. We came out of the airport. I ordered an Uber, and some 15 minutes later, my husband greeted us at our hotel, and I had the most amazing first experience flying solo with my kiddos. Love it. The hotel that my husband was staying in for work was super luxurious. It's called the Roosevelt. It's just minutes from the famous Bourbon Street. And since we got in late on Wednesday, we basically went straight to bed and we left all the sightseeing for the following day. And in the morning, we started with our Touro synagogue tour. I did reach out to them through their website prior to our trip. And if you ever go to New Orleans, I recommend you do the same. You can book a tour with a volunteer who replies to you very promptly. They actually texted me to set up a time that was convenient for me. And all I had to do was make a suggested donation of $18 online. And really, the whole process was super easy. No checking documents or anything like that. So, very good experience with Touro Synagogue. We took an Uber to Uptown, and there we were greeted by our lovely guide, the volunteer. She was this bubbly, smiley woman in her 60s, and she was standing by the front entrance of the synagogue. And then before we entered the building, she surprised us by telling us that Touro Synagogue actually partakes in the annual Mardi Gras parade. I really hope that my face showed more of a surprise reaction rather than any sort of judgment. But it's just that in my mind, I had always pictured Mardi Gras as a holiday of drunks doing mischiefs and women taking off their shirts for beads, right? So to have a synagogue participate in this celebration seemed completely contradictory and absurd at that moment. But after the guide explained exactly how the synagogue participated, it no longer seemed that wild. Let me explain. First of all, as a historic congregation, the synagogue has operated on the parade route since the early 20th century. And they, ever since, have been merging Jewish tradition with New Orleans culture. They host the Shabbat Gras, which is a special Shabbat service held during the Mardi Gras season to celebrate in local fashion. Then there's the crew of VIPs, which is an inclusive, accessible parade watching experience on St. Charles Avenue. And this is done for children with special needs and their families. They provide food, blankets, activities. Very nice. And finally, the initiative is supported by local volunteers and partners. They involve nearby hospital parking and community donations. They donate king cakes, which are these sweet braided Danish dough. They're served from January 6th through Mardi Gras. And this, of course, is a Christian tradition. But anyway, so after I heard all that, it didn't seem as crazy, right? But still, surprising. After this astonishing introduction, we went inside. The guide took us into the sanctuary first because in just an hour or so, there was supposed to be a jazz rehearsal for a jazz festival featuring some celebrated musician. Oh, and did I mention this is a Reform synagogue? See, not being used to Reform Judaism, there were quite a few curiosities that we took note of. The first curiosity, after the initial Mardi Gras surprise, was the guide's excitement about the upcoming jazz fest, Shabbat. Since New Orleans is known for jazz music, this religious establishment proudly merged religion with local culture and traditions. In fact, this year they held the 25th Jazz Fest Shabbat. Now, why is this strange to someone like me coming from an Orthodox shul? Well, Orthodox Jews do not play musical instruments or listen to recorded music on Shabbat. Why? To adhere to restrictions against creating music and also turning on electronic devices. Remember that on Shabbat, we are supposed to resemble God when He rested on the seventh day of creation. And since we are partners with God in the creation of life, according to His commandments, we must not work or create anything on Shabbat. And music is something that is created by an instrument. We can and should, however, use our voices to sing, to elevate the day through the spiritual joy. The Reformed Jews have taken upon themselves to change the commandments, so they allow instruments on Shabbat. And in fact, there is a grand piano by the stage, always there permanently, and a huge organ on the back wall. The latter not being so surprising because we had seen organs in various European and Scandinavian synagogues just in our last year's travels. We were surprised then, but now we're not surprised anymore because historically many Reformed synagogues have tried to resemble churches to try to fit in. But anyway, I have episodes about those synagogues that I just mentioned in earlier seasons. So if you haven't listened to them, I encourage you to check them out. In general, going back to the Touro synagogue, the sanctuary is magnificent. It has a 70-foot wide dome. It has vast arched window bays that are highlighted by multicolored geometric art glass. It's very, very beautiful. I also have photos from this synagogue on my social media, so take a look on Instagram or TikTok if you're curious. A couple other curiosities I'd like to mention before moving to the history of the synagogue include the Torah Ark, which, interestingly enough, slides open vertically rather than horizontally. And from what I understood, from what I gathered, this is unique to this synagogue. And it was designed to emulate the appearance of a Greek temple. This was a stylistic choice reflecting its early 19th century origins and the aesthetic preferences of its benefactor, Judah Touro. I'll speak about him in just a moment. The other curious fact was their congregation switching to new prayer books that utilize gender-neutral or inclusive language to describe God. So they wanted to move away from the traditional masculine he or him pronouns. I'm not going to comment in depth on this topic, but I will say that for Orthodox Jews, the way we see it and the way that we learn it from Torah, God is above gender. Sure, Hebrew uses masculine-oriented text and grammar for convention, but the Torah also uses female metaphors for God. So, to me, at least, this doesn't bother me at all. But I guess in the Reform synagogues, they are moving away from the masculine-oriented text in the Siddurs. Okay, so now let me tell you about the history of this beautiful Reform shul. The story begins in 1828, 25 years after the Louisiana Purchase. It was then that the first synagogue outside the 13 colonies came into existence and is now officially the 6th oldest synagogue in the country. According to the 1724 Code, Jews should have been excluded from the French territory of Louisiana. However, the business acumen of Jewish merchants proved more important to the financial future of New Orleans than upholding the rules of the French government. And so the prohibitions against Jews were inconsistently enforced. When President Thomas Jefferson negotiated the 1803 Louisiana Purchase with Napoleon and Louisiana came under the American jurisdiction, Jews acquired the right to freely inhabit what would become the 18th state in the Union, thereby realizing the value of religious freedom that would later become part of the American Constitution. As for the Touro Synagogue's congregation, it is the result of a re-merger between two original congregations. There was the congregation Gates of Mercy and Congregation Dispersed of Judah. Gates of Mercy was founded in 1828 and followed the Ashkenazic rituals. This led some Portuguese members who preferred the Sephardic tradition to separate and form Congregation Dispersed of Judah in 1846. On February 6 of 1881, the congregations reunited and moved into a building on Carondelet Street. The merger strengthened the Jewish community in New Orleans at a time when both congregations were struggling economically and recovering from the loss of many lives to the yellow fever epidemic of 1878. The new congregation eventually took the name Touro Synagogue, after the benefactor of both communities. Judah Touro, he was a merchant philanthropist and son of Isaac Touro, who was a leader of the Rhode Island synagogue, named for him also. The synagogue is wonderfully upkept today. It is very modern inside. It features a small museum of various Jewish artifacts from Touro's life and religious rituals. And I have to say, we really enjoyed the tour, and if you're ever in the area, you should definitely visit. The following day was Shabbat. And since we decided against joining a local host family for dinner, we had a makeshift Shabbat dinner in our hotel room. I had packed battery-powered candles with me, so we had the candles, we had some takeout food. I did not have challah, I'm afraid to say, but we did what we could with what we had. Then on Saturday morning, we headed to Anshe Sfard Synagogue, very first thing. In his email to me, Rabbi Rivkin had mentioned that because of the approaching holiday of Passover, there would be no meal at the synagogue. And for some reason, I took that as meaning there would be no Kiddush following the Saturday morning prayers. So then our plan was to get to the synagogue right at the start of services, which is at 9:15, and then after that we would explore the city by foot and find lunch somewhere along the way. When we arrived at Anshe Sfard, we quickly realized that we were the only ones there, besides the rabbi and one other Orthodox man, perhaps a family member. The rabbi greeted us and motioned for us to sit down. So my husband went to the men's section and I took the kids to the women's section. Not gonna lie, it was a bit awkward. Here in Cleveland, Ohio, we never go this early to our own synagogue. We typically arrive closer to 11 a.m. But for some reason, I thought maybe it would be different in this shul. Anyway, we sat there for a little while with my kiddos in these wooden pews. They must have been original from the 1920s, I think. We took note of the beautiful surviving architectural details, but also the wear and tear and the damage caused by Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, and then other later storms and floods. And in the lobby, we also noticed a campaign flyer to raise funds for remodeling of this building, because this building really needs remodeling. I mean, some parts of it look like it's fallen apart, but this building actually is on the National Register of Historic Places. So hopefully, when they gather enough funds, they can remodel it and it will be very, very beautiful once again. But the kids were getting bored sitting in this lonely service, so we went to explore. All of a sudden, one little girl showed up. She looked to be about the same age as my daughter, around 5 years old. So we followed her to the basement, and we found a little kids' corner there with games and puzzles. And soon enough, more kids began to show up. And then this very talkative 5-year-old girl, she filled us in on the rabbi's family. She proudly announced that she was the rabbi's daughter and that she was the 10th child and the youngest. She and my daughter instantly became besties, and they went off to play on their own, and my son stayed in the kids' room to play with the other older boys, which also were sons of the rabbi. I will never forget how this 5-year-old girl, with her hair way below her waist, dressed like an elegant lady in a white dress and a black blazer with these pearly buttons, she asked my daughter why she was not wearing Shabbos clothes. My daughter, she was wearing a simple summer dress and tennis shoes. She was at a loss for words to this very unexpected question, so she looked at me for reassurance, and I had to come up with some silly explanation that we were traveling and we had lots of walking to do that day, and whatever else I could reply in the moment to this tiny person who came across extremely assertive and authoritative. I couldn't believe it. But it was really cute, and it made me realize that Shabbat is so important to the Jewish people and that I should treat it with more respect. I should dress up more. I should dress my kids up to show respect and reverence for this very important holiday of the Jewish people. With my kids occupied, now I headed back to the service, and to my surprise, there were many more people now. Some were obviously Orthodox, while others were like us, traditional, I assume. And little by little, the place started filling up. But we had already been there for so long that I suggested to my husband to leave around noon because I thought he was feeling lonely and awkward in this new place, not knowing anyone. So he agreed to leave, and we said our goodbyes to the rabbi. We went outside to get our kids, but they didn't want to go. They were having such a good time, especially my daughter. And it was this gorgeous spring day. The kids were playing outdoors. It just was this idyllic Shabbat day. I absolutely loved it. There was a parked police car by the shul, kind of, giving us the feeling of being protected. And just, it was wonderful. And then the little girl came up to me and asked why we were not staying for Kiddush. And I told her that I didn't know there was going to be lunch and that we didn't plan on it. So I guess I had misunderstood Rabbi Rivkin and we should have planned differently. And I really wanted to stay, but I felt embarrassed going back into the service after already having said goodbyes. And so we decided to all leave. And as we were walking away, then my husband confessed that he wanted to stay too. And then I felt extra bad for making everyone leave. Now looking back, we probably should have stayed and it would have been wonderful. But I guess everything happens for a reason, because this way we did have time to visit the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, which I found to be very interesting and educational. So let me tell you about that. This museum explores the many ways that Jews in the American South influenced and were influenced by the distinct cultural heritage of their communities. One gallery traces the major migrations of Jews to the American South, beginning in the 1700s, and exploring how Jewish immigrants journeyed to American ports and navigated into the interior of the South. From establishing stores to synagogues, this gallery touches on themes including merchant life, social institutions, and religious practice. Another gallery focuses on the diversity of Jewish beliefs and practices, from holidays and life cycle events to the values that are foundational from Jews from the American South and around the world. The final gallery investigates Southern Jewish experiences during World War II and the Holocaust, the Civil Rights Movement, suburbanization of the rural American South, and Southern Jews in popular culture. We all enjoyed visiting this museum, and I do also recommend it. When it was time for lunch, we tried to locate the only kosher deli we found on Google Maps, but unfortunately, it was too far of a drive at the moment. The kids were super hungry and moody, so we settled for a Mediterranean place and ordered a bunch of different hummuses and pita, olives and cheeses, and that was really good. One curiosity that I want to mention is a synagogue that we noticed while walking from Anshe Sfard to the Jewish Museum. It was this colossal building with a menorah over the grand entrance and the 10 Commandments in Hebrew at the very top of the roof. It was only a 10-minute walk from one synagogue to the next, and we thought it was strange that they would be so close to each other and that we had not known about the existence of this synagogue when we researched New Orleans. When we approached it closer to read the pylon sign, we realized that this was not a synagogue, but rather a Baptist church. We were so confused because we thought we had heard our rabbi mention once that a synagogue cannot be repurposed for anything else, because once it's consecrated, declared sacred, there's no turning back, so to speak. But I think we must have misunderstood him, because after doing some research, we learned that, in fact, many synagogues have been repurposed with the approval of the owner and, of course, as long as the synagogue is no longer in active use. But the interesting thing about this specific synagogue is its history. It was originally built as Beth Israel Synagogue and was home of an Orthodox Jewish congregation. It was organized and chartered in 1904 when various groups merged to become Beth Israel. In 1906, they dedicated their first home in the old Shakespeare House, at the same address as the building stands today. This house used to be a Spanish plantation-type home built by Joseph Shakespeare, who was a mayor of New Orleans in the late 1800s. By the early 1920s, the congregation grew so much that they needed more space. And so they demolished the old house and built in its place a bigger synagogue, which provided seating for 1,200 people. The congregation remained at this location until 1970, but made the decision to build a new synagogue at a different location because the neighborhood around it, which had previously been part of the fashionable Garden District, had begun to deteriorate. Indeed, today you can see some shady 2-story apartment buildings in very rough shape right across from the now church and other small rundown residences. My husband really wanted to peek inside the historic building, but when we opened the doors, we saw there was an ongoing service, and so we didn't feel right disturbing it. And unfortunately, we didn't get to see the inside of it. But from the photos I was able to find online, the sanctuary is striking, with very tall ceilings, balcony seating, stained glass windows, and magnificent chandeliers. Although New Orleans was not exactly what I expected, I had imagined it to be much more charming and quaint. This trip was very memorable and special for various reasons. First, I very much enjoyed exploring Judaism in the southern state of Louisiana. Also, as we walked around the city, especially through Bourbon Street, at first, I kept covering my kids' ears and eyes every time I heard someone using foul language or some half-naked woman was passing by. But then my husband reminded me of something very important. Our job as parents is not to shelter our kids from the reality around them, but rather to teach them right from wrong, Just because they hear someone cussing doesn't mean they need to do it as well. Or just because people walk around drunk or dressed inappropriately doesn't mean they must follow the crowd. So I thought those were great teaching moments, thanks to my husband. And finally, due to the abundance of homeless people on the streets, I got to see the genuine, generous side of my husband in action. Yes, together we give tzedakah, we donate money online, but it's not the same as seeing him giving from his own hand to another needy person and teaching our kids to do the same in the process. It was really wonderful and unforgettable to me. Also, for some reason on this trip, I felt the closest to God I had ever felt. It was a sort of yearning for Him I had not experienced previously, and it felt amazing to know that God was with me every waking moment. From when I traveled for the first time alone with my kids to our worry free return home, I just knew that I was being taken care of. I had read about this ecstatic feeling when one misses God as if he were missing a loved one. It's similar to when you first fall in love and you just cannot stop thinking about that person. This is how I felt during our trip. God was always on my mind and I felt so connected to Him. It was truly amazing, and I wish I could feel this way all the time. I'm not sure why I felt this way during this particular trip, but I know my relationship with God has evolved since then, has strengthened, and has encouraged me to keep going, learning, and growing. And for this, I'm thankful. And thank you so much for listening. And until next time.